here today. This is our episode 4 of Iron Sharpening Iron. And I'm pleased to be joined this morning with BJ Sipe out in Danville, Kentucky. And a little bit about BJ. I've known BJ since he was a single college kid at Florida College. And then I watched him come out of college. He began preaching in Salem, Oregon, got married. And as of 5 weeks ago, BJ's now married, father of 2 in Danville, Kentucky.
I am. Yeah, 5 weeks ago, our son is named Dane and daughter named Ava. And there's that bulldozer working next door I was talking about. I don't know if you can hear that, Bill. Sorry about that. In the background here. There's my neighbor working.
Well, you have a choice of crying kids or a bulldozer, so
that was what I was about to say. It's either a screaming 5-week-old and 20-month-old or a bulldozer, and we'll just take the periodic bulldozer every now and then. It's what we got to do.
All right. Well, hey, I'm so pleased to have you on today, and it's been literally a year since I've seen you, but you're looking well, and I'm sure glad you have some time carved out in your schedule to join us today.
Oh, so glad to join. I appreciate it, Bill. Bill, I think we go back further even than Florida College when we were coming up as teenagers to Seattle to see Dillinger and to do other things up there. And I think you heard one of my first lessons I ever gave, and it was up there at Federal Way. Mm-hmm. And I remember you coming up and having some very insightful things to say. And that's where our relationship started, was with you helping me in my journey to become an evangelist. And now look, here we are talking about evangelism in our respective states and congregations, and it's great.
Isn't it interesting? 2 West Coast guys end up in the Midwest.
Yeah, go figure.
Well, now, those of you who are watching, I want you to know that if you have comments or questions, just drop it into the comment section here on Facebook, and I'll share those with BJ as we go along. Now, last week, you all had a chance to meet our very dear friend, Jack Hafer. And when BJ came out of Florida College, he went back home to Salem and spent 5 years working with Jack. And so as much as I love Jack and BJ respectively, they both have the same character flaw. And that is their football team that they root for. Any team that wears highlighter yellow is questionable. But I wanted you to know I checked the all-time record today. And
you did?
UW still leads that all-time record.
Hey, how's that been for the last 10 years, by the way? I'm just curious. The last decade, what's that record been?
Well, for us, it's like 2-12 or something like that. But there was the game in Oregon 3 years ago that's pretty notable. So.
We don't talk about that game. But
Puddles doesn't talk about that game. Puddles went off and fell headfirst into a garbage can.
Just so people know, as we get into this discussion, Bill taught me to become all things to all men with this experience. And so I didn't just insist that Bill come down to Autzen to watch the Ducks beat his dogs. I was willing to go up to Washington to watch my Ducks beat his dogs. And so you've just got to become all things to all men and be flexible.
Right. Good stuff. I will say, though, I think one of my favorite memories with you was with your brother and Travis. And we'd gone up to Safeco Field when they announced Ken Griffey's Hall of Fame induction. Yep. And just over my shoulder here sits my Ken Griffey bobblehead.
I love it, man. Good times, lots of good memories up in the Northwest, and
now here we are. We're in the Midwest.
And now we're in the Midwest. We'll have to make some more great memories here.
That's right. All right. Hey, let's go ahead and just dive headfirst into our topic. I asked BJ what he would like to talk about today, and I told him it was preacher's choice. And he said he'd like to talk about evangelism. And, you would probably agree with me. we could have 10 different preachers on for 10 straight weeks, talk about the same topic, and maybe not cover it all in the same way. So this is something that's always in vogue, right? Something we should always be talking about.
Right. Yeah, this is, there are so many things like that. If you ever get to a point where you think that you've exhausted a topic or have figured everything out regarding it, it just goes to show you haven't figured it out yet. There is so much when it comes to evangelism, so many different perspectives. And, we could have been on week 4 of this topic and still had new things to discuss and share. And I know we're not going to get through nearly as much as we want to get through today, and that's okay. And that's just, we're always studying and always bettering ourselves. And I'm real grateful that you're putting these kind of programs together, Bill, because it creates opportunities to do that very thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll bring this up again maybe a little bit later down the road, but a few weeks back I had a chance to talk with Mr. Hawthorne, and we were kicking around the 5 excuses that Moses made when God called him to go to Egypt. We still make some of those same excuses today, but the beauty of studying Moses in that way is to help us. Well, I might be a more reserved personality. I'm a more bashful person. I'm a single woman. How can I evangelize? What are things I can do to help further the gospel? So maybe we can talk about some practical things that folks can do. But I think just to get us going, why don't we read over in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. And here it says, Jesus came to them and said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Behold, I am with you always, even until the end of age. So there's a few things there we might want to maybe talk about. BJ, I think the first thing is the command to go. Is that command is still as relevant today as it was when it was given back then?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. Jesus, of course, in this context is talking to his close apostles, his 11 disciples, because Judas, of course, had betrayed him and was no longer with them. But this principle that Jesus is teaching here, it began with the 11, but it's something that is carried out by us still today. Jesus' command to go is, evident there in the text that this is something that we do, and that is that disciples make disciples. The 11 were to go out, which are called disciples in verse 16. But then he goes to say that they are to go and make disciples, which they were at that time, and teach them to observe all that Jesus had commanded them. And so Jesus here is commanding them to go make disciples. And so
Right.
if we're going to turn and make disciples and teach them to observe everything Jesus had commanded them to do, then those disciples are going to turn around and make other disciples as well. Evangelism is a disciple thing. It's not just a preacher thing or an evangelist thing.
Let me ask you a question. What is a disciple?
That's a great question. So a disciple is very simply a student or a learner, a follower of someone. You could be a disciple of a specific teacher or a disciple of a way of life. But in this context, a disciple is a follower. Jesus is asking them to make people who want to follow Jesus as they have followed Jesus.
Okay. And that, I think that's an excellent definition. I've always kind of used the Luke Skywalker Yoda illustration,
Right.
but it's interesting. I talked to a lot of college kids here. They're like, yeah, I don't, Star Wars, what? And it surprises me how many people don't know Star Wars.
Yeah.
But that idea of learning to be like the master, right? Doing the things that the master does. So when Jesus tells us to go make more disciples, that is making more followers of his teachings, his doctrine, his theology. Is that right?
Right. It's discipleship in that context. When you think about it, Jesus did not, come initially, to bring judgment. Jesus came to bring salvation. And really, as he did that, he came to liberate us from our way of living, from our way of life. And if we continue just living in our pattern that we do as people, that's where we find entrapment. That's where we find, struggle. But really, in following Jesus, it's like that paradox, or in that in giving up our life, that we actually find it, that Jesus was talking about. And so we're talking about real discipleship here. We're not just talking about, attending services. We're not just talking about, getting baptized or anything like that. When we start talking about discipleship and how that's going to be connected to evangelism, we're calling people to completely have changed lives, to radically change their lives, to follow Jesus. And, that's where we'll end up going with this discussion on evangelism. I think a lot of times when we think about evangelism, we think about getting people just to Christ, right? Teaching them about Jesus and getting them in the water and getting them saved. But there is so much more to it that we read in the Great Commission here. There's more to that process of keeping people in Christ. Evangelism is not just about getting people in the water. Evangelism is about helping people to become transformed, to become like Jesus, to truly be disciples of him.
For those of you who are just jumping on with us here in the last couple minutes, we're with BJ Sipe, who is in Danville, Kentucky, and we're talking about personal evangelism. BJ, let me ask you a question. I actually intended to ask this a little bit later on, but you kind of already alluded to it, so I'll just go there. If we take a minute and look at the parable of the sower, Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 23, we see some of those ideas taught there that you just touched on. So in that parable, Jesus is talking about soil, which is illustrative of the human heart. But I see 4 types of soil or human hearts depicted there. Is that what you see as well?
Yeah, the parable of the sower, of course, is the parable that Jesus kind of uses as his stepping point to help people understand his parables and his teachings. And you've got, 4 different types of soil, 4 different types of people who will respond to the message very differently. Some will not listen to it at all. They'll just reject it outright. Some will embrace it initially, but when they learn it comes with hardship or difficulty, then they're going to give up. There'll be others that, are always in competition with the word. They accept the word. They want to be Christians. They want to be disciples, but they're constantly, in competition with false gods and with the world and distractions. And so that's the fruit that gets choked out. And then finally, you have the good word, or the good soil, that receives the word and bears fruit. But here's the fascinating thing about that parable is you don't see the sower not sowing seed on the types of soil that he deemed, unfit. He's sowing the seed everywhere. He's not a judge of the character of the soil. He just sows the seed. And I think there's something really important for us to learn about that with the parable, is when we start talking about evangelism and making disciples, I think one of the worst things that Christians do is we try to pre-qualify who would listen to us. They need to look like me or sound like me or be like me, and then they might listen to what I have to say about Jesus. But if they look this way, or they dress this way, or they talk this way, then obviously they have no interest. And that's just one of the most foolish things that we can do as Christians. Are we trying to make people more like Jesus, or are we trying to make people more like me? And if I can be talking to people that look like me, sound like me, then I think it's the latter rather than the first.
Okay, so you're bringing up a really important point, and I want to digress just a moment. So you have people that reject the word, right? Just flat out, I don't believe there's a God, and so they just reject God's word. Then you have those that obey the gospel, but working overtime, or kids have an out of town baseball tournament, those types of things keep them from their discipleship, and they end up falling away. Then there are those individuals who obey the gospel, but come to church on Sunday and do absolutely nothing to further the Lord's kingdom, a Sunday afternoon to Saturday evening. And then you've got the fourth type of soil, which are those people who are gleaning fruit for the Lord's kingdom. Now, if we take the parable of the sower and we put it into baseball terms, right? You're talking about a 250 batting average. Right. And since we were just talking about baseball just a moment ago, we talked about Ken Griffey Jr. career batting average of 284.
Right.
So in baseball terms, you're like, okay, I can be successful 2.5% of the time, and people give me a special jacket and they say, oh, look how great you are. Yeah. Just for comparison, Edgar Martinez, career batting average of 312. But what you're saying is 3 out of 10 times you're successful. Man, look how good that guy is.
Right.
So what we're seeing is that only a small percentage of those who obey the gospel are going to go on to bear fruit for the Lord's kingdom.
Yeah, rejection is just a natural part of this process. And without jumping too far into, this hole here that we've opened up, I think rejection is one of the reasons, fear of rejection, why people just don't do anything in the first place. They feel like if I reach out to someone, I'm going to ruin this relationship, and I don't want to do that. So I want to, keep that and just try to influence people over time. So I'm not going to talk to them about Jesus. But we just need to recognize that rejection is just a natural part of evangelism, and just like you were talking about, it's not even about batting averages, even in that sense. You measure a worth of a baseball player by his average. And unfortunately, I know some people that they've approached preachers or Christians that way, that your worth as an evangelist or a preacher is your average of how many people did you baptize this year, right? Which number one tells you that they don't understand evangelism, because evangelism doesn't stop with baptism. But number two, it just doesn't understand it. We sow the seed, we plant and water, but God gives the increase. But just look at all the different instances of rejection of people that we esteem as great evangelists. Paul was so rejected at Lystra that they drug him out of the city and stoned him. I mean, that's pretty duty rejection. Jesus was rejected by his own family in his own hometown.
That's right, Mark chapter 3.
Yeah, it's just it's a part of this process of evangelism. Is as you talk to people about Jesus, and as you reach out to people about Jesus, the parable of the sower points that out with the 4 different soils. Most people, unfortunately, if you're going to try to play a numbers game, which we never should, but if you're going to look at it by the numbers, most people are probably not going to obey the gospel and follow Jesus with their life. Just said that himself, that the wide is the way that leads to destruction, but narrow is the way that leads to life. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that we don't do anything. We need to do something.
And you're bringing up a topic. It was another rabbit hole, and I want to jump down that rabbit hole for just a minute. And that is the idea that congregations get the idea sometimes that the preacher is their employee, and if he's not baptizing 12 guys a year, well, he's not doing his job. Yeah. But I look at it from a standpoint that, well, personal work and sharing the word of Christ is everybody's responsibility. Every Christian has a responsibility to go out and make more disciples. And so when a group or an eldership says, well, it's the sole responsibility of the preacher, I think there's a great misunderstanding there as to the role of the evangelist in the congregation and what fair expectations are or aren't for said evangelist. What do you think of that?
Yeah, there's so many. I could talk for an hour just about that, Bill. And I think you and I both probably run into people that have said to our face, that you are a failure because you didn't meet their expectations as to what they wanted you to do in a certain period of time. I know that I've had that said to my face. I was told at one period of my life, you've you only baptized, 3 people. And so if you'd have baptized 5, we'd have thought you were effective, but you only baptized 3, so you're not really effective.
Right.
And I'm not sure really what to do with that, but there's a couple things about that whole concept that I think the scriptures challenge that viewpoint that this is the evangelist's job. Number one, in Ephesians chapter 4, you read about these different positions and offices that God has given to the church in order to help the church. And in Ephesians chapter 4, and starting in verse 11, he says, he personally gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, and some teachers for the equipping of the saints in the work of ministry, to build up the body of Christ until we all reach unity in the faith and knowledge of the Son of God, growing into mature manhood with a stature measured by Christ's fullness. And then we will no longer be little children tossed by the waves, blown about in every wind of teaching, but by human cunning and cleverness and techniques of deceit. But speaking the truth in love, let us grow in every way into him who is the head. From him, the whole body, fitted and knit together by every supporting ligament, provides growth of the body for building up of itself in love and the proper working of each individual part. And so just to break that down, when you see what Paul is writing there, he says these offices, pastors, and of course we still have the words of the apostles and the prophets right here in the word, and evangelists and teachers, their role is not to just do all the work. Their role is to equip and train the saints, that's you and I, that's your everyday Christian, to do the work together. Right. You hire a tutor not to do the work for you.
Correct.
You hire a tutor to teach you how to do the work, and to combat people who say, well, that's why we pay the evangelist, that's his job. Well, no, that's just like you don't pay a tutor to do your work for you. You support an evangelist, and you don't hire him. You enter into a partnership with the gospel. It is not an employee-employer relationship.
Exactly.
But you enter into a partnership with the gospel and saying, help to equip me to do this work together. And Mike Wilson and his work that he's done on evangelism toolbox, great material. If you haven't read it or gotten a hold of it, I'd really encourage you to track that down and get it. But he talks about, that unfortunately, when it comes to evangelism, people have inserted the word personal in front of every time we talk about evangelism. And though there's certainly a personal nature to evangelism, the scriptures here and everywhere else speak of evangelism as a team effort. And team is really an acronym. Together, everyone accomplishes more. And that's how we're going to approach this.
Well, and I really appreciate these last few points that you brought up. Too many times, and I would say that there's very few congregations that are an exception to the rule, but the general rule of thumb is what I call the 80-20 principle, and that is 20% of the Christians are doing 80% of the work. And that's not really what Paul is talking about in Ephesians 4. Right. Everybody needs to be a part of the work. Everybody has a responsibility, right? So Jesus says, if the tree doesn't bear fruit, what do you do with it?
Right.
It's going to get cut down and cast into the fire. So there's an admonition from the Lord himself that each of us needs to be participating in the work of the local congregation, which includes sharing the gospel with friends, family. It could be the person who does your hair. In our case, right now, we're doing our own hair. But
yeah.
for those of you who don't know BJ, this guy has usually a great high fade comb over, and he decided to just take it all off. So
it was going to be minutes before I got my hair cut. I'm very sad about it.
Well, I look forward to the high fade comb over, brother. Hey,
yeah.
So then let's bring this and make it more personal.
Right.
If I'm going to engage in evangelism, what should be my motivation for getting motivated and involved in the work of the congregation?
That's a great question. Well, one, it starts, of course, with seeing things from the correct perspective, as we've talked about. I need to stop looking at this as this is someone else's job.
Okay.
Because if I feel like I'm doing someone else's job while I'm evangelizing, I'm never going to do it with the right motivation to begin with. So I need to just get that out of my mind to start with. This is about teamwork and team effort and synergy. Before I talk about motivation, just as a caveat, just as a convicting moment for those that are tuned in and listening, think about the rate of conversions that you have in a congregation and people that are coming to the Lord and staying Christians. Usually it's pretty low across America right now in most churches. And the reason for that is probably because most congregations and most Christians view it the wrong way. This is the evangelist's job. Well, if you have one person doing the work of everyone, don't expect the kind of fruit that you would get if everyone was doing the work. You're going to expect the fruit that one man can bring, that one person can bring. So you've got to start, first of all, changing how you think about this. This is not the preacher's job or anything like that. This is our work as a village. It takes a village collectively together. But as far as motivation, I think the best way to talk about that and start with that is to actually look at Jesus and his motivation for why he did what he did.
Absolutely.
So just two passages for us to think about. Number one, Jesus in Luke 19, verse 10, kind of gives us his mission statement. And in Luke 19, verse 10, he says, "The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." If that was Jesus's purpose and mission in this life, and I'm a disciple, remember, a disciple is a follower of Jesus. I want to do things the way Jesus did. If that was his mission, his purpose statement, then what's my mission and my purpose statement? I need to learn to see souls and look for opportunities to share the gospel with others. But all of that won't happen unless, as you implied earlier, the motivation, I have the same kind of compassion that Jesus did. And that's the passage I wanted to look at. In Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38, it said that Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of harvest and send laborers to the harvest."
Yeah, that's a tremendous passage. And again, Matthew in chapter 14, verse 14, if you take Matthew 9 and Matthew 14, you see Matthew's recording for us how Jesus felt. But if you look at Matthew 15, verse 32, Jesus outright makes the comment, "I feel compassion for the multitude." So now we know how he was feeling, but that's exactly one of his motivations, is that he has compassion. And so then I think we naturally need to ask ourselves, well, do I have compassion? Do I feel that level of love for others that Jesus had for others? Paul in Romans chapter 9, verse 3 said, "I wish I could be accursed and separated from Christ for the sake of the brethren." So here Paul is demonstrating his level of love for others. And I think that's the first place we have to start. If we're going to change our thinking, okay, so we've now identified that it's not just the preacher's job, it's not just the elder's job, it's everybody's job. Well, now I have to start having a compassion and love for people in the same way that Christ loved people. Is that how you see that?
Yeah, Bill, I think one of the biggest challenges to this whole concept, and this is something that you and I struggle with. Every Christian struggles with this at some point. We hate to say it this way, but the problem with why we don't reach out to lost like we should is that sometimes we just don't care. And we would never put it that way. Well, obviously I care. Well, I think apathy is probably the greatest sin of the Christian, because we view people, we don't see people for who they are, whether they're lost or saved. Salvation is a black or white issue. People are either lost or they're saved. And if they're lost, Jesus recognized their great need. He saw the crowds and they were helpless and lost like sheep without a shepherd. And if I'm viewing people that way, then I'm not just going to view people as, well, that's just my barista, or that's just my mailman, or that's just my neighbor, or that's just my teacher. I don't view them as just there to serve me. I need to think about the concept that I'm here to serve them. And I'm here to reach out to them and love them as much as I can, and share with them the hope that I have in Jesus Christ. And when we don't, it's because, and I hate putting it that way, but it's just because I haven't cared enough to think about them and their condition. I haven't cared enough to say something. And so I do nothing. And so apathy, I think, is one of the greatest things that we struggle with as Christians.
I think you're exactly right. And for those who are watching, we're talking to BJ Sipe in Danville, Kentucky, and we're talking about evangelism. And you probably noticed we signed on a little late today because we had a technical problem. On BJ's end, he's got a neighbor working on a bulldozer. So that's probably what you're hearing in the background. There's the beeping of the bulldozer.
He just stopped it and waved at me and asked if I was doing something. I said, yeah, and he's moving on. So it's all good. So
that's awesome. Well, that's a good guy right there.
He's a nice guy. He's a nice guy. Yeah.
Now I want to come back to something you've said. You actually said it twice now. And so I want to hone in on it for a minute. I'm the type of guy, and maybe it's just because of my first career, I have this level of self-confidence, but I don't look at like a Hell's Angel biker and go, ooh, I'm not sure I want to talk to that guy. But there are individuals who say, well, that person has off-colored hair, or they have plugs in their ears, or they've got piercings over their eyebrows, or wherever, and so they don't look like me, right? We live in a culture now where even young gals are tattooing their arms, and so am I guilty of looking at an individual and saying, well, they look a certain way, or better yet, they don't look a certain way, so I don't think they'd be interested in hearing the gospel? That's got to be one of the most sinful ways to think about other people is, well, they don't look like me, or they don't dress like me, or so I don't think they're worth sharing the gospel with.
Right.
There's one individual that I think of that is a good person for us to consider. That is Jonah. One of the reasons Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh is because those people were the arch enemy of his own people. And so he had a prejudice problem in the same way Peter had a prejudice problem, didn't he?
Yeah.
And so we need to not look at the exterior of an individual. I don't care if it's plugs or an Iron Maiden t-shirt or purple hair, right? That person has a soul that needs to be saved. And I need to have compassion and love for that person, just as our Lord did, just as Paul did.
That's right. I'm going to tie something in here, Bill, that maybe I'm wrong, but I think a lot of this perhaps stems from our culture as American Christians. We're very arrogant and proud as Americans. And so consider this, and I've cited this before. Royce Chandler talks about this in one of his writings he did in a lecture series. And he talks about Jack Gray in his work on American experts and how people view Americans in other countries. And what he talks about is that Americans display these feelings of superiority, that they know the answers to everything, or that they want to take credit for things, or that they really they're not interested in coming and helping people actually, do work their way. They're interested in coming and making people like them personally. And as American Christians, I think, unfortunately, a lot of times we spend far too much time, like we've talked about already, trying to make people more like me rather than trying to make people more like Jesus. And so I have this idea that Jesus was this, homeschool, white, conservative, Republican boy from Alabama, and he was nothing like that. Stop trying to make people like you. And there are so many things that we create barriers for and actually prevent people from entering into the kingdom of God because I've judged them unworthy because they've got blue hair or they've got tattoos. When in fact, some of the most spiritually minded people that I know that are working for the cause of Christ today have blue hair and tattoos. Those things are not important. So long as someone's clothing is modest, the style of clothing that they wear is not important. The color of their hair is not important. I'll tell a real quick story on this. I was visiting somewhere, and I will, of course, not say where, but I was so discouraged and talked with the preacher afterwards because he got up there and talked about walking into a local shop and said, I walked in and I knew already that this girl was going straight to hell and that she was lost. She had blue hair and she was listening to rock music. And I just knew that she was going to hell.
My.
I couldn't believe that this man was filling a pulpit and saying these things to a group of people that were trying to learn about Jesus. And what was ironic was his wife was sitting there and she was probably in her 70s. And she had the most vibrant, beautiful yellow hair, which was very obviously not natural. And why is it righteous for his wife to have dyed yellow hair, but it's sinful for this girl at a store to have dyed blue hair? Is color now a sinful thing? We sound as ridiculous, in mind the phrase, we sound as foolish and stupid as Christians did when they made judgments about race in the past. You're using the same kind of logic when you judge someone unworthy because of the color of their hair. It's just absolute nonsense. And sorry,
can you imagine if when Jesus got to Jacob's well, had he shunned that woman not only because of her nationality, her ethnic background, but he knew her personal history. Being the Lord, he could have really chastised her right there, couldn't he? But he didn't.
Absolutely.
He showed love and compassion for her, and she ends up doing, as the point you just made, how much work did she do for his kingdom in a very short period of time?
She went and got the whole city together to hear Jesus.
Yeah, she got the whole town to come out.
Yeah.
Hey, come check this guy out.
Mm-hmm.
And her personal history aside, maybe there's a conversation that's not recorded for us, but so far as we know, he didn't belittle her. He didn't look down the edge of his glasses at her. But I think you're right. We as American Christians, have the tendency to be quite proud, don't we? Arrogant, really.
Yeah, it really is arrogance. And, Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that we no longer regard others according to the flesh. And I have to ask myself, do I really obey that teaching? Do I not regard others according to the flesh? Or am I pre-qualifying people because of their image and because of what they look like? When isn't that what discipleship is all about? We're transforming people from the inside out. Am I more concerned with making people look good on the outside, or am I actually concerned with making people like Jesus on the inside? And if my focus on evangelism is on appearances to begin with, then perhaps what I'm trying to create is not disciples of Jesus again. I'm trying to create people to just join my little club, make me feel better about myself and how I carry myself. No, that's not what any of this is about. We need to make people like Jesus, and that's all about what's taking place on the inside. And certain things, of course, physically on the outside will change as people become more like Jesus.
Yes.
But that doesn't happen before they know him. So stop qualifying people and just.
That's right. In Isaiah 59, verse 2, Isaiah makes the comment that your iniquities have separated you from God. We need to remember that verse, because when we come across individuals who are not spiritually minded, you need to treat that individual just as you would a lost child in a park, right? How many of us would come across a 3 or 4-year-old child that's lost in the park and just go, well, he'll find his way. There's not an individual that wouldn't, hey, where's your mom and dad? And, try and help that little boy get to where he needs to be, right? But yet we look at people, and it doesn't have to even be the unnatural hair or piercings or anything like that. We just look at a person and go, I don't think they'd be interested, so I don't.
Yeah.
Right? And coming back to this parable of the sower, I need to just sow seeds. Now, as we're coming down to we've come across the top of the hour, we've probably got about 15 minutes left. Let me just shift our focus just a little bit. Let's talk about some practical ways of being evangelistic, particularly for those who are more bashful or quiet personalities. So what advice do you have for somebody who's, those of you who identify as a wallflower, how can somebody like that start getting involved with the work of the congregation?
That's a great question. And so to start with, it's understanding that not everyone has the same role, right? I think a lot of people, they say, I'm not very personable, or I'm not outspoken, or I'm not a teacher, which not everyone should be a teacher. James talks about that.
Correct.
And so we say, well, so I can't do evangelism. That's not true. Remember, evangelism is not just about getting people into Christ. Evangelism is about creating disciples, followers of Jesus. And so how many different things need to happen in the life of a disciple and a growing disciple for them to continue to follow Jesus? They're going to need mentors. And so maybe I can't teach someone, like as I view other teachers and say, I don't have that ability. I'm not that kind of person. Well, I can act as a mentor to a new Christian, a young man or a young woman, and help them along and encourage them. Jeff Carr and I talked about mentorship at length for about an hour a couple of weeks ago. There's all sorts of things, showing hospitality, opening up your home. I'll give a shout out to a woman back in Salem. Her name is Barbara Morrow, and she still owns some property out in Sisters, Oregon. And what she would do is, even though she's not a teacher, she would organize these classes and have all of her family come in and different people. And we'd have like 16 people there gathered together in her home. And she would invite Jack to come in, Jack Hafer, who was on last week, to come in to teach. And I got to go one time, and she'd bring Dave Larson out. And so she was making huge contributions to this work. And it's a team effort. It's about, synergy and everyone offering something together. There was this Canadian horse poll that I remember reading about one time, where one horse by itself pulled like 6,000 pounds, another pulled like 5,000 pounds, but together they pulled 30,000 pounds.
Right.
And that's incredible. That's what we're talking about. When different people offer different things and contribute different things, we are molding people and growing into being more like Jesus. And that is all a part of evangelism. And I think the biggest thing I can say, what can you do, is this right here. One of the areas that we often don't view as evangelism, which we absolutely need to, is how we raise our kids. Because evangelism is about reaching the lost. And at some point, our children enter a state where they are accountable, and they are in desperate need of the grace of Jesus just as much as we are, and they need saved. And I think so often there's this expectation in the church where when someone's son or daughter that's kind of been raised, to know the Lord, obeys the gospel and stays faithful, we just kind of expect that and we don't think anything of it. But when someone like outside in our community does so, we're really excited about it. We've got to stop thinking about it that way. Our children, that's the most important area and battleground in our life, is in fighting for their souls and teaching them about Jesus. And so even if you're not, out in on door knocking or doing those kinds of things or posting social media things like this. Your work with your children is the most important contribution that you can make to the work of evangelism. And don't ever let someone tell you otherwise. It is so important.
Yeah, and as you were talking just then, I'm reminded of the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 11, starting in verse 18. Moses says, "You shall therefore impress these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead." Verse 19, "You shall teach them to your sons, talking to them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you rise up." I think a lot of parents are guilty of getting trapped in thinking that it's the church's job to teach their kids to become Christians, right? It's kind of like the American thinking for public schools, right? It's the school's job to teach my kids. Well,
Right.
no, teaching begins at home with mom and dad, right? And it's not just the teacher's job to teach your kids, and therefore it's not just the job of the Sunday morning Bible school teacher to teach your kids. You need
Right.
to be actively engaged in teaching your kids spiritual things, and not just on Sunday.
Right. If you signed up to be a parent, you signed up to be a teacher. I'm sorry, you did.
Absolutely.
And that's your responsibility. And one day I'm going to stand before Jesus and give an account as to how I taught my daughter and my son and any future children, perhaps that God blesses us with. And that is my responsibility. I'm not going to say, well, the elders failed my children or the Bible class teachers failed my children. No, if they don't learn Christ out of, the reasoning that they just weren't taught, then that's on me.
Absolutely.
That's my responsibility.
And I would submit to you that since we're talking about evangelism, the same type of thinking that says, well, it's the church's job to raise my kids or to teach them spiritual things, is the same type of attitude that says, well, it's somebody else's job to share Christ with others. Right?
Isn't that funny that, not to get into this discussion, but many conservative Christians are very concerned with how we, of course, use the Lord's money and what we do with it. And so there's a lot of disdain for, we're just going to pay this other program or pay this other, institution to do this work, and that's what we'll consider, doing this. We've done the work that we've been called to do. Well, no, you just paid someone else to do it. You actually haven't done the work. Well, isn't that exactly the attitude that we have when it comes to evangelism sometimes? Well, I'm just going to pay someone else to do the work. I've done my part. I cut him a check, and so now you go save everybody, and I'm going to sit at home and watch Netflix.
Right. And the problem with that is that I don't think the church, the local church, right? We're talking about just local congregation, does not have the right to abdicate its authority to anyone else to do the work that it is responsible for doing.
Right.
And a lot of times when you see the local church paying another organization to do that work, it's usually not in the area where the congregation exists.
Right. That's exactly right.
But that's a conversation for another day, isn't it?
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but Bill, I'll tell you what, we are very good at creating excuses as to why it's not my job. But we need to be a whole lot more like Isaiah, where Isaiah just stood up and said, "Here, my Lord, send me."
Absolutely. And so as I was kind of looking at Jesus's ministry, we've already kind of covered pretty well that Jesus had a compassion for lost souls. I would submit to you, with what time we have left, that Jesus had a purpose to serve the will of his Father. In John chapter 4, verse 34, coming back to the woman at the well, the disciples come back with food, and they're like, "Hey, Lord, you hungry?" And he's like, no, I've got food you don't know about, but that food is to do the will of him who sent me. Right. So Jesus had a compassion for lost souls. he also was willing to submit himself to the authority of the Father, and that was part of his mission.
Right.
And then I'd say there's a third one, and that is that Jesus loved the Father, John 15, verse 9. And because of his love for Jehovah God, he was willing to do the work that he had been sent here to do.
Right.
Sorry, I'm managing two mouses at the same time here.
That's all right.
Trying to come back to your outline here.
My bulldozer's here anyway.
Okay. So the fact is that there's a lot of work to be done, and sadly, there's not enough people willing to stand up and volunteer. And you just mentioned Isaiah. Here I am, send me. But more people need to have that type of attitude about evangelism. Don't you agree?
Right. Yeah. Well, and going back to Matthew, 9 and everything that Jesus said there, Jesus at the end said, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few.
Correct.
The problem is not the harvest. And I think that's what a lot of people say when you look at, unsuccessful years. I'm not talking about just, a month or whatever, or an instance. I'm talking about a culture in which evangelism is dead within an area or within a congregation where we're just not reaching the lost. And you talk to people about why that is, and sometimes what people say is, well, it's just, it's just the culture here. People just don't want to hear the gospel. That's just not true. That is absolutely false. It's never been that way. Look at everything that was going on in Rome and all the garbage that was placed there, and the gospel thrived there. It's because people recognized the need and that the harvest was plentiful, and there were workers that stepped up and got, picked up the bat and took a swing. And that's what we need today, is we need to stop, again, making excuses and saying, well, the culture, the people around me just don't want to hear it. Well, some certainly don't. And we've talked about that already. A lot of people are going to take, the easy road out, and they aren't going to want to follow Jesus. But that does not mean that there is nobody that wants to hear the gospel. There are those who are looking for Jesus. And just as God is seeking those worshipers, back to the woman at the well in John 4, God is seeking such worshipers. Jesus was seeking the lost. I need to be doing the same thing and roll up my sleeves and get to work and recognize that it's my responsibility. I want to be a worker, for the Lord. I want to get to work.
Well, here's another exciting aspect to think about. Just kind of reflecting on how you and I know each other and our years of friendship. Nothing would have pleased me more than to have had the opportunity to work with Paul Hawthorne on a full-time basis. That would have, and I'm sure there's guys that you look at and go, man, boy, if I could work with that guy, man, that would be like a crowning achievement in my professional life, right?
Yeah.
When we engage in evangelism, I don't think people put it in the context that we become fellow workers with the Lord. Right. And Paul says as much in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. And this is, of course, Paul is talking about God's providence in our evangelism efforts. But he says, Apollos watered, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So then neither the one who plants or the one who waters is anything, but God causes the growth. Jump down to verse 9. Paul says, we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Mm-hmm. And if people would look at that and meditate on that, perhaps we get more excited, more enthusiastic about evangelism and serving the Lord's kingdom. So we've decided that, we need to have compassion. We need to love people and be willing to do for them just like you would a lost child in the park. And maybe a better way to say it would be, if you came across somebody who had been hit by a car or had been in a terrible car accident and they're injured, I would hope that, like the Good Samaritan, that you would stop and render aid. Well, that's the
Right.
same way we need to think about people who are lost to the world. Those are people who are spiritually injured and could certainly use some spiritual first aid. Then we need to understand what Jesus's purpose was, the love of his Father, and being willing to do that. Well, if it was good enough for him, it ought to be good enough for you and me, right?
Right.
And then understanding that when we do engage in working for the Lord's kingdom, that we are working co-workers or fellow
Together.
workers with our Lord.
It's teamwork.
Teamwork. All right, you've got, I'll give you 3 minutes to close out our live stream today. BJ, what would you like to say to everybody who's watching?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. Number one, I want to lift Bill up and just thank you, Bill, for the work you're doing. When you talk about evangelism, one of the things that makes Bill so successful in everything that he does is because he possesses a lot of these traits that we've talked about today. Bill cares about people. He loves people. He's not afraid to talk to anybody, and he doesn't judge people on their appearance. And he's not tied to his comfort zone. I mean, Bill went from big city Seattle to horseback ride in Kansas, and is doing great work for God there. And I just want to lift you up, Bill, and thank you for your work. And I'm so grateful that we've got guys like you on our side that are doing this work for God. And so I'm so grateful to know you and blessed by you and your example. You continue to teach me and mentor me in my work. So thank you to start. But I think what I'd like to say at the end is just to reiterate in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, what Paul says there. And he says that the one who plants or waters is nothing. This isn't about us.
Amen.
This isn't about me. This is about teamwork to bring people to a knowledge of the truth and bring them salvation in Jesus Christ. And so whether you have seen success or as a church or not, if you've seen success, well, number one, as an individual, don't get a big head thinking that I've done this. You haven't. When there's fruit that's produced, it is a team effort. And we all are co-workers in God's work. And so don't take credit for something that you shouldn't take credit for. Give credit back to God. It is God who gives the increase.
That's right.
And I'd say, secondly, if you have struggled and if there just hasn't been growth for a very long period of time, go back through and just examine, are we really approaching things the way that we should? Are we praying about this? Are we praying for this ministry and for souls of our community? Am I making pre-qualifications, or am I actually reaching out to all who I come into contact with? Is this just something that one person's doing, or are we all trying to do our part to do something together? And so it takes a lot of time to turn a ship around, and it's going to take time to create a culture of evangelism within your local churches. But it is an amazing thing to see when it starts happening. I've been a part of churches where there is a culture of evangelism and everyone is doing their part. And, in just the short periods of time I was there would be, 15, 20 people that were brought to the Lord, and they're still faithful today. They're disciples of Jesus today. And that kind of growth has continued in those places. And that's because they're doing this right. They're doing this God's way. And that's what we need to do, is we need to do evangelism not our way, not the American way, not, BJ's way or Bill's way. We need to go back to doing this God's way. And that is simply seeking and saving the lost, having compassion on others enough to love them and serve them and make them more like Jesus, not more like me.
Well, BJ, I really appreciate you taking some time to visit with us today and encourage us in the realm of evangelism. I appreciate your kind words, to reciprocate, to watch you go from young single college guy to mature dad of two has been a real treat. And you've always been very talented and blessed in the realm of being a worker for the Lord. And so I wish you Godspeed. May God continue to bless you and Kylie in your future. I hope that the Lord will bless Ava and Dane as they grow up and that they will become strong servants for the Lord as well.